Why hello there, spooky artisans. Today we're going to be upcycling some scrap paper and plastic bags to create these vintage inspired Halloween folk art candy corn decorations. Let's get started. What you will need is a bunch of random packing paper and or paper bags. I'm adding some stained paper I made a few years back. You can even experiment with old book pages and newspapers if you wish. Brown, black, white, orange, and yellow acrylic paint of your choosing. And a spray bottle. I'm using a mister, and some cups of water for your brushes. A variety of brushes, but we're mostly going to be finger painting, so add those phalanges to the list. A hair flat iron or regular clothing iron to flatten out the paper. Some writing and maybe cutting devices. A sewing machine of your choosing, however no one's stopping you from sewing this by hand. A bundle of plastic bags that we're going to be using for stuffing. Paper or cardstock to cut out a stencil. I'll be using leftover backing from some sticker paper I used to make stickers. These come in handy in so many ways. And now for the fun part. We're going to crumble all our paper to soften it up to give it a bit of a rough fabric feel to it. So just keep crumbling and uncrumbling till you get a very malleable fabric texture. I encourage you to mix different types of scrap paper for different textures. With regular paper, you may have to crumble a bit gently at first, then work your way through till it's soft and flexible. Now let's flatten out all our paper with a flat iron, smoothing everything while keeping the crinkle texture, which will look very neat once we paint over it, giving it that rusty, crusty, worn out vintage primitive look that we love so much. Alright, our stacks are looking pretty nice at this point. Let's go ahead and start making our stencil. I'm just folding a piece of paper over and starting from the center and kind of just drawing a half candy corn shape. I'm not the best at drawing, so I really need to sketch all this out pretty well. And then once you're happy with it, cut it all out. Voila, we got our stencil. I'm assembling the paper by gluing 2 pages together for each side for a total of 4 layers, leaving the middle unglued because that's where we're going to be leaving room for the stuffing. I'm being a little rambunctious here with the glue. Just add a small dab to the center so it doesn't reach the sides. No need to smear it all over. This will make more sense later in the video when we cut the sides. I went ahead and cut out the edges of my stencil to see what I'm doing. We're just marking out a sewing guide from our candy corn shaped stencil. Keep running a pencil to it till it's dark enough to see while we run it through the machine. You can also sew this by hand if you don't have a sewing machine. Now that we got all our layers glued, we can start sewing. Start from where I'm pointing and end at the same spot on the opposite side, leaving an open space in the middle for stuffing. It helps to start off and end with a back stitch so it doesn't unravel easily. When sewing paper, I recommend sewing with a wide stitch, so your pages don't rip while painting over it. When sewing the corners, I like to stop while the needle is down and lift up the foot, and then turning the page to whatever direction I need to go. That helps to ensure that you do not rip the pages as you sew. Alright, now that we got all our stitches done, you can see that we left a little space in between on the bottom so we can stuff it later. Now we get our paints together, including what I didn't mention in the beginning. We're going to be using some pigment ink. Makeup pigment works as well, and we're going to mix those two and glide it over the edges for a cool patina effect. Don't forget your spray bottle. I'll be using a variety of paintbrushes, nothing too specific, and most importantly, fingers. We're going to be using our fingers a lot, and some water and paper towels as well. I'm snipping off leftover thread. I'm diving in head first with orange. I'm using the candy corn color scheme of yellow, orange, and white. Roughly paint these stripes through and then flip it over and repeat on the other side. Here is where my backing for sticker paper comes in handy. I just place my paper over it and it helps keep things a little bit tidy because the paint doesn't seep through. Now I'm going to go ahead and organize all the paints I'm going to need on a separate sticker sheet of paper, or you can use a paper plate as well. Wet wipes are your best friend in this project. I'm taking the brown and I'm going to go ahead and layer it and spray it just a little bit. You can go ahead and spray your paints as well so they don't dry out as you're working. But just kind of dab and dab and dab, and that's pretty much how you're going to build up all these colors. But you want to start with the brown layers first and then work your way to darker layers. As you can see, I'm kind of mixing a mixture of brown and black to give it depth. Let's take our small paintbrush and add paint and dab along the stitches. We want to build up the dark colors on the stitches to give it even more depth once we plump it up with stuffing. There is no rule for this technique. It's all about dabbing and smudging with your fingers. It helps to spray some water on your fingers as you paint along. That makes the paint a little more workable. A damp paper towel helps to wash out colors if you think it might be too much. If the paper is too wet and not holding paint, set it aside to dry and then continue to work at it. It's all a matter of layering colors. Flip over and repeat on the other side. You may find it helpful to place a paper towel down so while you're working on the top, the bottom is drying just a bit for when you're ready to flip over and add more layers. If you feel that you may have spread too much of the dark colors on the lighter colors, have no fear. You can go over it with whatever color you need to stand out, and that should fix that problem. Every now and then, spray the whole thing and press a paper towel to it to blend everything together. At this point, we can start to rip the edges. I'm spraying some water to make the paper easier to rip off. You don't have to add water. I'm using the burnishing knife, but you can use whatever you have on hand to press onto it and use it as a guide as you start to rip. This part requires some attention as you do not want to rip the paper from the stitch part. Do this to all the layers until you have this frilly edged look. Now we can paint around the edges and rip as you go along if needed. Now that we've made quite a bit of progress, we can finish off the details and painting the rest of the edges right after we stuff it with plastic bags. I'll be using a combination of plastic bags and scraps of crumbled up paper. Work your way through a few plastic bag chunks at a time. If you're having some trouble, grab the eraser part of a pencil so that way it grips better with the paper and the plastic, and slowly start to just push it into the very tips and kind of working it through the corners. Use your fingers and thumbs to wedge the smaller pieces of plastic right into the corners. Alright, now let's go ahead and flatten out this bottom part and seal it. You can sew it or use glue. In this case, I'm going to use hot glue because it's going to be quick and super easy. You're going to want to follow along the same path as our sewing stitches we did prior. And just kind of work that right in there. I don't know, the color's changing for some reason. Alright. And just press and hold for a little bit. You don't want to move it all the way to the edge because you want the little frillies to still be separate from each other. Just like that. For our little bow and flower embellishments, we'll be ripping scrap papers at widths of 3 inches wide and however long you want your bow to be. And then we're going to cut in some little square pieces for our flowers later. I'm going to be using brown and black paint mixed in with some Elmer's glue, and you're going to spray that down with some water and make a big old mud pile. And now we scrunch our wet piece of paper until it forms into this little flower, and you want to kind of start off from the center towards the outer ends and then kind of work your way in, lifting the ends up so that way the petals are more prominent. Hold it through with a little piece of wire or rubber band or some string and just let that air dry. Or if you have a dehydrator, you can put it in there too. Or blast some air with a hair dryer, which, by the way, you can be using throughout this entire project, FYI. Okay, same thing, only this time we're going to be making a bow. So you want to douse that pretty well in water and make another mud pile with glue and paint. And I'll smear this concoction over your wet piece of paper so we can start molding our bow. This part may take a little practice because you're going to want to start to twist from the center out, and sometimes you can rip it. Most of the time, from what I've learned, is you can work the rip part in the twist, but if it's far gone, then don't worry about it. Just start all over again with a fresh piece of paper. Now I'm just squeezing out the excess concoction water and forming it into a little bow with the handle on top, and lay it flat so that way it air dries in this shape. And here is what we are left with after it is done drying. That looks just great, doesn't it? Adding glue to the water helps it to dry out in a very sturdy shape, so you can pull on the petals a bit to give it a little more character. Now we're going to sandwich the bow from the middle in between the frilly edges with a hot glue gun and work it in there till we get a sturdy handle attached for hanging. Any little imperfections will be covered with the bows that we're going to attach on each side above it. So it's okay if you add a little too much glue, it's going to be covered up anyway. As you can see, there's a little ripped piece, and we can go ahead and attach that back into the center with some extra glue and just hold it in place. And there, like nothing ever happened. Now we take one of our little flowers and apply a generous amount of glue right there in the middle and press it on, and repeat the same thing on the other side. We are almost done. We just need to add some color and highlights to the bow and the flower. Same thing we did to the outer edges on our candy corn. In this case, you can apply the same concoction you use to scrunch up all of the bows and flowers with glue and mix that in with your paint as you're painting along the bows, so that way it's not so delicate. I'm going to speed up the drying process with my heat gun set all the way to cool air and just kind of blast it with that cool air until it dries out, so we can move on to the next step. I'll be using a golden pigment powder mixed in with glue to give it that patina look. I'm dabbing some Elmer's glue on my fingers and just dipping it right into the powder and just rubbing it with my fingers as I graze over it gently right at the very surface. And this adds a lot of detail and makes it look super rustic, antique-ish, grungy, primitive, all the vintage words you want to use. If you don't have crafting pigment powder, you can use some old eyeshadow that you're no longer using, just as long as it's shimmery, and you can crush that into a little dust and mix that in with the glue. You can experiment with different shades of this powdery, shimmery stuff. I went with the gold because I think it looks good with this color scheme. Now you kind of glaze over the top as well to give it some highlights. I think that gives it a really cool look too. Alrighty. Here is our finished product. Wow. It's squishy, but not too squishy. It's not too delicate because the paint makes it a little sturdy. But I think these make an excellent addition to any type of rustic, vintage, inspired Halloween theme you got going on this year. You can also apply a clear waterproof sealant if you want to hang these outside and make them more weatherproof. And another idea, you can stuff these with crinkly paper and some candy and seal them up so people could just rip right through them. If that hurts your soul after all the work you've done, you don't have to go all out with the little details. You can just paint the candy corn colors and call it a day. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and/or subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I wish you a very spooky holiday.
Bye-bye.